sort of some way of connecting up the diets, the consumptions here. So you need all the standard data that I was talking about before, catch and fisheries independent data, but you also need stomach data, you know, what's in the guts of these fish. Physical models. Again, I think you have improved realism. If you have a ROMS model that shows, you know, and that shows temperature, salinity, those sorts of things that drive where a stock might be, given their preferences for temperatures, I think that's useful. You know, stock assessment models don't really take into account that spatial structure, which could be important to folks who are out fishing and how far they have to go to fish and that sort of thing. So to get this sort of information can be quite useful, but again, it's another layer of complexity. You've got to have physical or oceanographic models, and you have to know how fish respond to some of the environmental variables in those models. And you know, it gets harder to interpret. You're moving outside of the framework that managers are used to thinking about. Then we get these horrendograms, these food web models, something like an EWE model. You know, so it's like there's multi-species models, but you're really trying to get the whole food web in there because you want to get primary production. You know, it kind of makes sense that the production of the whole system is kind of tied to how much primary production is in the system, right? I mean, so that gets, you know, difficult, and you need, there's that stomach data, all this additional data on taxa that we don't target. So maybe there's not a lot of studies done on, say, jellyfish in a system or some sort of, you know, mollusk in the system that's not a harvested thing. But we're moving along with those. Aggregate biomass, this is sort of interesting. So same sort of idea, but you start to simplify that food web model by aggregating the groups. You know, say this are our benthic invertebrates, and these are our pelagic piscivores. And then you can also start thinking about managing in that way. Instead of setting limits on, you know, a particular species, you just set limits on the biomass that can be harvested in sort of that niche or that aggregate group. And that allows a little more flexibility for folks who are going out fishing. You know, you don't have to have a license for 12 different fish species. You just have to have your pelagic piscivore license, and then you can report back on what you catch. This is something they're moving forward a lot with the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in Woods Hole. Biogeochemical models. So now this is, if I say ecosystem models in a group of marine scientists, I think this is more like what a lot of folks would think about, especially physical and chemical oceanographers. You're thinking about NPZ, you know, nitrogen, phytoplankton, zooplankton, some carbon. And you're thinking about terms of carbon flows, which can tell you a lot about the structure of a system and stability and lots of sort of those ecosystem aggregate sort of responses. But these aren't routinely used, and they're pretty unfamiliar to fisheries managers. And then finally, full system models. Have you all seen at least one or two talks about Atlantis? No? Okay, I was going to guess so. I was like, I'm putting the pressure on Cam here. It's like, Cam, you've had your students talk, right? So yeah, something like that, where you're going from end to end. So sort of all those different components I talked about here, you start to really go from, let's pull in that circulation model, pull in that NPZ model, pull in that food web model, pull in fleet dynamics models, all in one big model. And these are quite complex, and there's a lot of information that needs to go in those. But I find them useful because if you can sort of build that model, even if you don't have all the data, you now have a useful framework for understanding how the system works and where you might need additional data. And that's sort of another management decision we don't think about. Managers make decisions about harvest, that sort of thing, but they also make decisions about where are we going to do surveys, what kind of research are we going to do to understand the system. So just the effort of building these models can be very informative for that purpose. All right. All those ecosystem models, what are we using them for? Why do we need them? You know, we're providing information for stock assessments, for protected resources, you know, marine mammals, sea turtles, habitat, and just sort of integrated ecosystem assessment. I'm not going to go into what that officially means, but you get the idea. We want to start making decisions about the ecosystem as a whole. So I will touch on these things a little later. Management strategy evaluation. So instead of doing the control rule approach, where we say, okay, we've now reached this point with the system, we have to make this fisheries management decision. Well, you know, we have to reduce the catch. Well, there may be 3 or 4 different ways you can reduce the catch. So you can use an ecosystem model to explore those 3 or 4 different ways to reduce the catch. Do we reduce the size of, or increase the size you can catch, reduce the number, reduce when you go fishing? You can plug that into an ecosystem model and see not just how it affects your target stock, but how it might affect other players in the ecosystem. We also are moving towards using a range of models. Instead of just using that one stock assessment model that you make a decision, use a range of models. Our friends in the Weather Service, when they forecast hurricanes, use 6 or 7 different models, and those models are often ensembles of other models. So it may be 12 or so models, because every model is a simplification, and you know, different structures, you simplify different things, might have different biases, so it's good to do that. And this generally that trade-off analysis that I talked about before, and really starting to make, you know, provide the ecological information and the bioeconomic information to really think about, you know, how should we be fishing these stocks so that everybody who's fishing gets treated fairly, but we are also maximizing the use of the resources or optimizing the use of the resources. All right. So how are we applying these sorts of things? In my mind, and what we've been talking about in the EBFM world is there's kind of 3 levels of management advice, right? There's Heurism, tactical, and strategic, right? So Heurism, you know, we just need a good idea of how the system's working. We don't need a hard and fast quantitative decision. We just like to, you know, have some indicators of what's going on in the system and how different perturbations to the system might influence, you know, what we can catch, you know, 5, 10 years from now, or 50 years from now, and just good for advancing scientific theory. Tactical management, that's really what I talked about with stock assessment modeling, that you have specific goals for a particular fish stock, and you want to know, what if I fish this at this level, am I going to have a healthy, sustainable stock over the next few years? And these are typically binding, so there's some laws behind it about making these sorts of decisions. And so we are actually moving towards applying ecosystem models in this tactical approach, which is pretty difficult because if you consider the data and the statistical theory and all that goes into a stock assessment model, and you magnify that times, I don't know, 1,000 in an ecosystem model, you know, the fact that we're getting managers to hear us and think about this is useful. So this is an example that I'm going to come back to later, where they've used multiple species. So they have their single species models, multiple models, an ecopath with an ecosim model, and a multi-species forecasting model to look at the levels of different fish stocks over, I forgot what the period of time is, but you see here they're, you know, relatively in agreement. Pollock, though, is like, wow, this single species, this little forage fish, single species shows there's, you know, a big increase, and these 2 models show not that much of an increase in the stock. We got to be careful here. So that's more of a forage fish thing that I'll come back to in a bit. And then strategic, you know, really, again, talking about trade-offs, and also thinking about cumulative impacts. Like in the Gulf of Mexico, you've got, you know, your occasional oil spill, you've got hypoxia, you've got, well, tons of things. I can't rattle them all off. You know, other impacts from habitats on the shorelines and that sort of thing. So to start to be able to model things besides the effect of fisheries on stocks is going to be is important, and but it's, you know, a lot harder. We don't have sort of standard data sets for some of that stuff like we do with single species management. So that's why we kind of think of these as bounding in scope. We're not going to tie you hard and fast to these rules yet, but more sort of given these 3 or 4 different stressors and how they are interplaying, here's what might happen in climate change. You know, how might, you know, your different stocks look in 20, 30 years from now, and what can you start doing now to plan for that? Right, and so we also have done some work with that where, a lot of folks are just looking at, this MSY. Every species, if we just fished every species at that sort of the maximum sustainable yield level, is that the same thing as if you looked at the maximum sustainable yield of the ecosystem? And often, I think this is a Northeast case in different scenarios. That's often not the case. Sorry. That's somebody else's slide. So how are we doing this? What are we doing nationally and regionally to really move forward these principles and these ideas? We started about 10 years ago in our ecosystem modeling groups around different centers saying we need to start getting together and talking more often about how to do this. So we started NEMOW, the National Ecosystem Modeling Workshop. That's NEMOW right there. We're NEMOW. All right, guess somebody say, "Oh, that's good." And I'll point this out because we just had one of these workshops earlier this year, just across the water from us here at the Southeast Regional Office. And this is really, like I said, just kind of a chance to folks start sharing best practices, getting new ideas about how to do this modeling, thinking about the different questions that are being asked in the different parts of the country about how to do ecosystem-based management and how to model it. And so we want to, establish some best practices and ultimately establish the review processes that you need. So beyond just sort of getting a paper published, you've got to also satisfy a bunch of stakeholders when you make a decision, and that's a pretty tough level of peer review. The first go round, we sort of, I point this out. If you're interested, I should put one more there. We have multiple technical reports if you like to read long documents. But if you're interested in any of this, you can certainly, I'll share these reports with you. But first go around, we just sort of talked about what software packages are people using or what are people building themselves. This was before R was so hot. Now everybody just does everything in R. Recommendations, what kind of data you need to use, how do you validate, how do you parameterize. The next go round, we really started talking about uncertainty. And it's funny, we really broke down uncertainty. This is a figure we worked with Randall Peterman from Simon Fraser University to sort of build and modify. But if you think about how we do management, so there's sort of an ecosystem, things going out in that marine ecosystem going on. We sample those ecosystems and collect some data, and uncertainty there is just observation error. Whatever gear you're using doesn't sample everything. There's also just natural variability that you sample things at one time, but what's going on later might be slightly different. Then there's a model, and there's different models have different assumptions, different structure. So there's uncertainty with structural complexity. There's communication uncertainty. I just showed you those complex horrendograms, right? How do you explain to somebody what all that means, and how do you get them to buy into that when you go talk to managers and stakeholders and policymakers? And then how do they then specify those objectives? And ultimately, when you put those into place as laws and regulations, sometimes people don't always follow the law. I don't know if you all are aware, but that happens. And not necessarily intentionally. Sometimes it's just a timing issue. Your data, you're collecting daily data on catch. You're getting close to the catch limit, but people just went out and had a really great catch, that week, and boom, you're all of a sudden over the limit. So those sorts of things we have to take into account. And that management strategy evaluation I talked about essentially is just taking this and putting that into a big complex modeling system and tinkering with these levels of uncertainty and different strategies for managing to see how you can, make your regulations actually do what you wanted to do given all of this. That's one way of saying it. Another workshop, this is really cool. And going back to the structural uncertainty component, we said, we need to use multiple models here, like our friends in the Weather Service do. So we had folks from the other disciplines, oceanographic modelers, climate modelers, hurricane service come and talk to us. And we really, when it comes down to it, there's a lot of effort in building and running the multiple models, but then how do you tell people about that? It gets really difficult, right? If you have a watch, you know what time it is. if you have two watches and they're not like synced up like most watches are these days, they're never telling the exact same time. So what time is it really? I'm not sure. And so that's what happens with these models. You have slightly different outputs, slightly different results. How do you tell what's going on? And ultimately, with the Weather Service, yeah, they have models saying a lot of different things, but there's one forecaster in the hot seat on his shift that says, yep, the hurricane is going that way. 5 models say it's going that way. One model says it's continuing north. Another model says it's going, to the right a little bit, to the east. And somebody has to come and come to that conclusion. And they have developed some nice tools like the cone of doom. And so we're thinking about how do we do that sort of stuff with fisheries management. And then finally, we've been talking about trade-offs, and we got a lot of folks here. Bill Arnold was there to talk about some of this stuff. How do we deal with that? I mean, once you start, we know trade-offs happen. You make a decision about a stock, it's going to affect other stocks. Once you start to make that decision, or once you make that explicit, how do you get it to where the stakeholders are happy about that? That's the tricky part. And we're also talked about some of the tools for, again, visualizing some of this complex information. Big points here, this effort was part of what helped develop the roadmap, get the roadmap going, one of many efforts, I should say. We established some regular meetings of this, apply some national standards so that we can review these models, and we really are pushing towards using multiple models when you're using it for a management context. For a particular research project, yeah, just build a model, get it published, get going. But then ultimately, when you have to go talk to managers, it's better to have multiple models so you can say, well, there's some uncertainty and here's where it is and here's why it might be. So not just build the models, but also be able to interpret those. And then the key thing where really comes up every time is to engage with the stakeholders for multiple reasons. I often use the McDonald's versus Subway approach. So McDonald's, you go, you say, I want a Big Mac. Talk to the person up front. They turn around the back, and eventually somebody throws something up front. They hand it to you all wrapped up. You walk off. You're not sure what you really have there. It's all wrapped up. You're not sure if it's what you wanted. Subway, you go, and I'm not advocating eating in either place necessarily, but at least as you go, you see what's getting put on there, you know what's in there. So this idea of kind of working iteratively with stakeholders so they see what's going into your model is seeming to be a good approach. And also, a lot of them have some insights that you might not have. If you're just looking at piles of data that somebody else collected, sometimes you don't have that insight about what's going on in the system. So bringing in that sort of local ecological knowledge can be useful. Yeah, so our big goals for this sort of stuff is, like I said, we want to, with models, we want to help conduct science to understand ecosystems, understand the drivers and threats to the ecosystems. We want to be able to explicitly explore and address trade-offs. And we want to start getting the stuff where it's regularly used in management advice. So we're going beyond just the control rule, happy face sort of stuff. And where we're doing it systematically and regularly meeting with our management groups. So I do it on time here. I'm going to move along a little bit. Oh, I should mention we are also working on building a toolbox. So a lot of these models are built, somebody does a bunch of coding and then somebody else does a little bit more. We're trying to get this all into one toolbox with a nice user interface. So once you've collected data that you need for one model, you're well on your way to building 2 or 3 other models, and also helps review processes and standards and that sort of stuff. So that's kind of long. But I should have put this slide up earlier now that I've started talking. So this is sort of where all NOAA Fisheries Service has to play in the water. So this is sort of all the spots where we have different science centers and regional offices that work with managers and do the science and make some decisions about not just fisheries, but marine mammals, sea turtles, habitats, and there's St. Pete right there. And we have sort of these large marine ecosystems, which are sort of a United Nations approach of looking at the world. Then we have our exclusive economic zone. That's the official written in the law approach to dealing with fisheries management, We have these SRGs, and I always forget what SRGs are for, so I'm going to look to my CRO friends. Yeah, I remember what that's doing. But anyway, it has to do with protected resources, study something groups, and not just, and also different fisheries commissions. So we have fisheries councils and the EEZs, and then state level fisheries commissions. So those are, I don't know how the fish know that they're in a state managed area or a federally managed area, but there's certain fish that are considered federal water fish and other fish that are considered state water fish. So we have to work with all those groups, and not just in the continental U.S., Alaska, and Hawaii, but we play in, we're playing with, I shouldn't say play, we're working with groups in Antarctica, you know, krill fisheries and that sort of stuff. Have other territories. We have the Arctic, there's oil issues, lots going on. So I just want to kind of highlight some of the regional efforts, very much as a highlight. And part of what I like to do is just because if you'd asked me about this 10 or 12, here's a list of sort of the models and the different regions in Alaska they're building these. So the Eastern Bering Sea, Gulf of Alaska, Aleutian Islands, Arctic, ROMs, biophysical models, food web models, and qualitative. I should mention that. I should talk more about that. Conceptual models, quantitative or qualitative network models are very useful. We can talk later about that though. You know, if you'd gone to Alaska 10, 12 years ago, they maybe had 3 or 4 of these efforts going on, and now they've really expanded. And as we talked about pollock earlier, in that graph I showed you earlier, this is the Scientific and Statistical Committee. So this is the group that when you build your model, they have to review the output and then go talk to that council to say, here's the recommendations we make. It's more complicated than that, but generally, is that a good? So that graph you saw earlier actually went into making some decisions about dialing it back on how many pollock got caught because there's a lot of predation on those. And this group, so each of these, we could spend a seminar on each of these models. So they've got all these models, they've got these global climate models, looking at climate change scenarios, overlaid with different fishing scenarios to help understand how can we best fish given, and kind of manage to optimize our resources given the changes that are likely to happen with climate. So if you're ever looking for a job, apparently they got a lot of people working there. In the Northeast, again, lots of models they've developed over the past 10, 15 years. And again, doing this management strategy evaluation, developing conceptual models to get stakeholders to understand, and then using that to evaluate different scenarios and how those scenarios perform as far as what types of things they want to happen with fish stocks and marine mammals and that sort of thing. And I'm going to roll on. Northwest, again, lots of models, 3 different models. Not Northwest, this is just the California current in general. Running multiple models and using that to make some decisions about how fishing sardines can affect all these groups here. And presenting that to councils and using that to drive decision making. And they're, you know, again, they highlight synthesizing availability data, helping to understand where we have data gaps, testing out top-down and bottom-up stressors, and testing out different trade-offs and management strategies. And then finally, the Southeast, where we've got decisions being made about coastal Louisiana. You know, they're going to put in a bunch of diversions there to try to rebuild marsh, but those diversions or dams, you know, will alter the salinity regimes, and how will that affect different fish stocks? So they're using a multi-model approach, using that to make actually habitat decisions. This isn't a fisheries management decision. It's more how does altering the habitat affect the fisheries? So it's actually the group within NEMOWs that deals with habitat permitting is using these models. So that's kind of exciting that, yeah, we are using these outside of just fisheries management, though I have not led you to believe otherwise. Sorry. And then I wanted to point out, you know, in the Southeast, we had one of your own students doing some management strategy evaluation, looking at different fishing management options, harvest control rules, and how that will affect stocks in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm not going to talk about that because you can talk to Cam about that later. So what's next? Again, management strategy evaluation, really quantifying and being implicit about trade-offs, coming up with ecosystem level reference points. So not that just that simple graph I showed early on, but how do we build a graph like that that sort of talks about the whole ecosystem and interactions. And the big thing to me is the stakeholder engagement is really the tough thing to crack. We're getting pretty good at building models and pulling together data and making those equations happen, but to get the stakeholder buy-in and to make decisions that kind of makes everybody equally mad, at least, maybe not everybody happy, but at least equally mad. How do you do that? Because, don't read all this, but this is from a UN report that I was involved with. The idea here is that, okay, no model's ever perfect. You're never gonna get a perfect model. But if you don't have some models that everybody can see the inside of and understand how it works, they have their mental model of how the system works. They know in their heads that if I fish species X, it's gonna do this to species Y. Or if the water temperature is this way this year, we're gonna get a lot more species A next year. So how do we make sure we're all reading off the same sheet music at least when we make these decisions? And then once you do that, then you got to go to the other extreme of, these are just quantitative models. If you don't believe anything about them, if you're just a pure skeptic, you're not going to learn much. And if you're just got rose-colored glasses and everything and believe everything then is correct, you're not going to believe much. So it really is about exploring and understanding what's going on in the system and using that to make the best decisions you can in sort of a more realistic frame. So with that, it's getting late. It's time for beverages, so I'll stop and take any questions. Did I convert anybody into a believer? No. But, yeah.
So now that we're in a political environment where all regulation is bad and all federal agencies are facing cuts, NIH did really well, where the head of NIH went to the Hill and said, here are the 7 medical miracles that we promise if you increase our funding. So what's the best example of how using more sophisticated ecosystem models has produced a miracle? So what's the best success story?
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff in there. And I'll say, in this political environment, this current political, NOAA has done okay. We're in a different department. We're under the Department of Commerce, kind of tucked away, and
Still got a weather guy coming in.
yeah, right. And we've got stakeholders who've been involved and have done some cooperative research. So we've got some support there. So I don't think we're in a position where we've got to, pull off the miracle right away. I think we've got enough buy-in that nobody's. Sure, everybody would love to have no regulations, but they're also realistic and say, yeah, and I've heard watermen say this, it's not me. I mean, I'm following the regulations, and I'm not going to take too much, but I know this guy and that guy and this person over here, they're going to take more. So we need something. So that's one thing there that I think why I keep emphasizing the stakeholder engagement, because they get it to some extent. And I'm sure Bill and other folks might have other instances of the other extreme. But the miracles,
The miracle would be people saying good things about the National Marine Fisheries.
Yeah.
That would be a miracle.
Yeah. But to me, like your reef example with the parrotfish, with no models, you kind of got everybody to agree to, hey, let's not fish these parrotfish, right? So that's that's just another example of how the stakeholders have enough of a good mental model that they can go along with a lot of this stuff. But miracles, that's a tough one to think of right now. Those sort of highlighted examples there. Well, maybe one of them is some in the California current on the West Coast, how they implemented some regulations that we're not going to fish these forage species ever. You just don't even think about it. and they used a lot of models, and that, so it sort of kind of walled off an area. Like, okay, that's going to ensure some stability if we don't mess with sort of a large swath of the forage fish. So that's actually pretty miraculous. I'll go with that one for now. How about that? So that's one. But we're still early in the game yet, and we'll see what happens with the political climate. But thanks for the question. Yeah. Any other comments, questions, concerns? Oh, on the way back there.
On the, to make the models work, I would imagine you need to have monitoring and information that comes in.
Yeah.
How flexible or how easily is it to change either what you're going to measure or the effort you spend on measuring that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And as I was pointing out before, one of the reasons I like these bigger models is that, yeah, you can highlight the fact that, hey, here's some things that we need to know more about that might be really influencing the ecosystem, and we need more information on them. So I can't say that, yeah, somebody's gone and taken a model and said, we know nothing about jellyfish. They're maybe pretty big predators on juvenile fish, so let's start a jellyfish monitoring program, right? We don't have that, but we definitely have now, people who are paying more attention to jellyfish, doing some research, looking at how many jellyfish are in stomachs of fish as a sort of an indicator of what's going on with different gelatinous plankton. So, that sort of stuff takes a while to bubble up. We've got a pretty strict framework, of our surveys vessels that are out there monitoring fish stocks, and that's, takes a lot of people, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of capital. So it's not entirely flexible. The other thing that we've done a lot of is cooperative research. In the Northeast, they're trying to develop a cooperative research fleet. So they take, groups of fishers and go out and survey areas where we don't typically survey, like right off the shelf break. That's not where we do a lot of surveys, but there's a lot that goes on the Atlantic shelf break, just because there's some structure there, things happening, and physical processes happening. So that's, where we can start to build that flexibility, and then eventually you can maybe demonstrate, yeah, we really need to have, more surveys going on here and more standardized surveys. So, yeah, it's not entirely flexible, but everything with the government takes a little time, right? So that's why we've been talking about this for 20-some years, maybe longer.
So down in the trenches where, somebody who's pressured to get a stock assessment done, by next month or something like that, and they're not interested in pushing the bar for getting ecosystem-based management, on its feet or anything. They want to get their work done.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think? What is the average stock assessment scientist? What interest do they have in ecosystem modeling? Are they interested about how things are affecting their species that they're working on, how that species is affecting everything else, conflict between sectors, fishing sectors?
Yeah.
If you're preparing an ecosystem consideration chapter, what is it that most people are interested in this for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, first, I can't imagine an average stock assessment person, because they're just very different mindsets in different parts of the country, right? And one of the things that has been going on, and Mike can tell you more about this because he's been involved with this some, is it's just sort of these general ecosystem status reports. So before you even do or aside from any modeling you do, any of the data you've collected up and down the ecosystem from, time series on phytoplankton or chlorophyll A to, what's going on with the warm blob or El Nino or other big climatic drivers, to, what's going on with, different fishery stocks or whatever, socioeconomic concerns, I should say, not stocks, but fleets, the people who fish them and socioeconomic concerns. So that's sort of warming up people to think about this. So with that, you do get some stock assessment folks, like we've talked about the gag grouper and red tide mortality. I think each region kind of has their own issues that sort of get them to kind of pull their head away and move on. And it really, unfortunately, sometimes takes stocks that, we've done everything we can here and we're just not recovering the stock. And so I've got to pull my head up and start thinking besides just this. So that's probably the big thing. Every region's a little different, but that's sort of getting that baseline.
You think it's an act of desperation to move to ecosystem model?
Well, maybe for some people it might, and I think that's going to be, and that's probably where we'll see this happening more and more. Stocks that just aren't recovering, or also forage fish tend to be, they're just sort of naturally an ecosystem concern. So those types of groups do tend to think about them more than, if you've got a stock that's been run along just fine for 10 years and no major problems, like let's not fix it if it's not broken. And that's sort of the NEMS approach, is let's prioritize and focus this sort of effort where it's needed most. Yeah.
Make sure I can phrase this right. So I've noticed, when you go to collect data, you only collect information when you're looking for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the stakeholders and people involved in fisheries are out there on a very regular basis, and without knowing it or doing it intentionally, they're kind of collecting data on a very regular, continuous basis, which in fisheries management or in research we might not necessarily be doing. And I think that's where a lot of the skepticism comes from the public, is that stock assessments are only done every few years, as you mentioned, and perhaps there's not the most up-to-date data in even the ecosystem-based business models that are being used for those management decisions. So to what extent is stakeholder engagement and stakeholder observations, or those loosely called data, being integrated into these types of models?
Yep. And I will 100% concur that a lot of the skepticism from stakeholders, I've been to meetings where they say, you don't know what you're talking about. You go do a survey once every few months and you sit behind your computer and build a model. I'm there every day. And so that cooperative research I was talking about before, I'll give a specific example, because you're right. If you're out there every day, I've had a fellow biologist say, these folks can read the ocean like a trout fisher reads a trout stream, right? They just, you get so this friend of mine, John Manderson, had what he called the butterfish smackdown. So what he did was he took a group of fisheries biologists and a group of stakeholders, and then had statisticians to kind of work with them to build sort of a statistical model of what's driving the butterfish stock. And they had pulled together as many different data sets on temperature and you name it, biological issues, temperature. I can't recall any of them to my mind right now. Anything that people had tossed out as ideas in the past, made sure they had those data sets together, and then they let the stock assessment type biologists select their variables, and then the fishers select their variables, and then build a statistical model to predict the butterfish biomass, changes in butterfish biomass, and guess who won? Stakeholders won, right? And so he then took that to say, okay, we're going to work with you, and we're going to make some changes to the stock assessment model. And just long story short, the stock assessment process is really difficult because it's such a tight process. It's been done the same way for so long. To get a new variable into a stock assessment officially is really difficult, but eventually working with that stakeholder group got them where they would take into account the bottom temperature ocean. So not the list of 6 or 7 variables that the fishermen came up with, but at least one thing that then use that to adjust catchability. That's a parameter. I didn't get into way detail. When you do the survey, you're not catching everything out there, and there's different. But they use that to adjust catchability, and ultimately they showed, actually there's a lot more butterfish out here because we've adjusted, and that's what the fishers have been saying all along. Yeah, there's a lot more fish out here. Quit dialing down so hard on this. So, so that cooperative research sort of thing is something that we're doing within NEMS to get more of that sort of knowledge going on, and so that's been very effective in that particular instance. And trying to build a research fleet that way would be useful, I think. Yep. Mike.
I had a question in response to sort of the moonshot, like.
Yeah.
I wonder, do you think there are gained, if you can get this right, are there gained efficiencies to be had in sort of science and management costs and effort?
Yeah, I think, yeah, for each, I keep forgetting the number, it's several hundred fish stocks that NIMS has to produce assessments for, on a regular basis, year, or sometimes you get a little more time, right? And so you've got all these groups of people, it's not just one person doing that. I mean, you do all the, taking account all the survey and stuff, put that aside. Just the people who are doing the statistical model can be a group of 5 to 10 people, right? And there's overlap. I mean, people do working on multiple stocks and stuff. But if you took, in your region, if you had, say, you have to do 50 stock assessments a year, but there's 30 or 20 or so that are, these populations are doing okay, and you could just, okay, we're just going to do an ecosystem model that has, all 50 species in them, and we're just going to, for the stock assessment, there's 20 or so species that are doing okay. Whatever comes out of that model, we're going to go with that as our stock assessment. So now you've got one model, still taking a lot of people to build it, but it's not taking as many people to build it. So that would be a big efficiency in my mind, and or that idea of sort of modeling stocks as aggregate biomasses that interact and sort of knocking out a lot more species. That would be a big efficiency. And so that's back to the moonshot question. We do talk about this sort of approach will help make things more efficient, but we haven't demonstrated it yet because we're still in that hump. All right, see you, Bill. But that's one of those sorts of things. I don't know. Did you have some other ideas? You think about this sort of stuff a lot.
No, just when you talk to Rick Mathot, who's sort of a stock assessment-centric guy, these things only add complexity to our complex system. And so, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's hard to marry the two in groups like mine, like the system we have.
Yeah.
So this regulatory environment is an immutable term.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one thing we have to sell is that these models can simplify the job of stock assessment as well as make it more complicated.
Yeah, right. Well, the other thing that I kind of talk about with this, and I'm on the record, so I'll be careful how I say this, but people like to sue NIMS. That's part of when I talked about, there's a peer review and then there's another level of review, and part of that other level of review, frankly, ultimately is, hey, let's kind of not get sued here. So let's make sure we really look at this hard. And so with these models, if you can, do some management strategy evaluation, test out a management strategy and see some unintended consequence that you can capture that in the model and catch it before you actually implement that procedure, that might reduce the number of lawsuits. And to me, I don't have any idea, but I'm guessing we spend a lot of money dealing with lawsuits every year. So that's, to me, another really big moonshot, but it's hard to sort of quantify that we've done that. Maybe that Pollock example I talked about with Alaska might be the one, but that's to me, something that's really the big advantage of using this is that you can deal with those unintended consequences or notice them before they actually happen. Was it Keith Sansbury that has the quote, if you want to try a new management procedure, it's better to test it out in a model before going out and just doing it in the real world. So that's probably the biggest benefit to all this. Yep. Cool. All right. So any other questions? Ran a little long here. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for your attention. Appreciate it. All right. Is it beer 30 now? Yeah. Well, I wanted to talk to you.